Hello, and welcome to this Noble Science of Defence training video. In this video, we're going to look at the 8 pressures. When you are fencing, when you are fighting with your opponent, you should not do anything without engaging your opponent or their blade, preferably their blade. So, if I'm fighting my opponent and I make an action without engaging the blade or the opponent, then I allow them to move willy-nilly and make a counter strike. I may strike my opponent, but what is the point of that if my opponent strikes me? There are ways that I can engage my opponent, which we'll go into in another video. This is not that video. So in this video, we are going to look at how to interact when you engage your opponent's blade. So again, if I'm fighting my opponent, I want to engage their blade first. And now I know where their blade is, where their weapon is, and what they are doing with it. The 8 pressures is a way to learn how to safely interact with your opponent's blade when you are engaged with it. There are only 8 possible directions in which your opponent can push your blade. So the 8 pressures is a way of learning each of these pressures from a large pressure to begin with, narrowing it down to a small pressure, and then a very, very fast reaction that will always be safe. So, the ways in which your blade can be engaged. You can be engaged on the strong or the weak. You can be engaged on the outside of your blade or the inside of your blade. And you can be pressed either to the inside of your body or to the outside of your body. These are the only possible actions. Weak, outside to inside. Weak, outside to outside. Weak, inside to inside. Weak, inside to outside. Strong, outside to inside. Strong, outside to outside. Strong, inside to inside. And strong, inside to outside. There is no other way that your blade can be pressed. So we're quickly going to run through the 8 pressures and the safe response to each of those. So before we start, something to remember is I'm going to use my forehand parry, my forehand ward, or my guardant. If my blade is pushed across my body, whether engaged on the inside or the outside, if they press across my body, I will use a guardant. Beyond that, if they are on my weak, I will use a parry. If they are on my strong, I will use a ward. The reason for this is because if they have their weak on my strong, I can control their blade. And so when my opponent presses on my strong with their weak, I will simply ward it, control their weapon, and essentially make a strike from there. That's going to be their mistake. If they are engaging their weak on my weak, they have a potential to come in, and so I simply move it offline with the parry. So let's quickly go through the 8 pressures. So the first is my opponent can engage on the weak of my blade. If he engages on the weak on the outside of my blade and then moves to pressure my outside quarter, then I will make a parry. If my opponent engages the weak of my blade on the outside, but presses to my inside quarter, then I will make a guardant. My opponent engages on the weak of my blade on the inside and presses to my outside quarter, I make a guardant. My opponent engages on the weak of my blade on the inside and then presses to my inside quarter. I make a parry. My opponent engages the strong of my blade on the outside. He presses to my outside quarter. I make an outside forehand ward. My opponent engages the strong of my blade on the outside and presses to my inside quarter. I make a guardant ward. My opponent engages the strong of my blade on the inside. He presses to my outside quarter. I make a hooking guardant. My opponent engages the strong of my blade on the inside and presses to my inside quarter. I make an inside ward. So these are the safest options for each of the pressures. These pressures can be practiced initially very obviously. So I'm going to engage my opponent on his outside at the weak, and I am simply going to push my weapon directly across them. I'm not making any bones that I'm trying to attack my opponent in this situation. I am simply giving them a pressure to respond to that is very obvious. So I engage the blade and I simply press it across my opponent. It makes it very obvious for them. In fact, in this case, they're not my opponent, they're my training partner. I am assisting them in their training. So in this very obvious pressure, Michael will feel the pressure and make his guardant to defend it. This, from outside to inside, when you're going to the same quarter that you are engaging, it's a little bit more difficult to get a very obvious pressure. So what I'd like to do here is press my sword to their shoulder. And if Michael adds a little bit of pressure to my sword, then he will feel this move towards his shoulder. And then he can make his parry as he feels the pressure. As you train this more and more, you increase the sensitivity. So at the beginning, I make it very obvious to Michael that I am, in each instance, moving there. So there, in this instance, Michael felt that he should parry. He was incorrect. And now with that same pressure, this is why I want an obvious pressure at the beginning, because to start with, you're going to think of which of the actions you should be doing. So the first training of this should be making those pressures very obvious, so that the feeling of doing it incorrectly is also very obvious, and you can learn to trust your feeling rather than your sight. So I press my blade to his shoulder, and again you see he starts to make the movement he thinks he should make, realizes the pressure is wrong and changes it. So now he's learning to react to the pressure. However, now I'm going to be very mean. You want to bring this sensitivity down to a millimeter either side of my center. That's how sensitive this needs to be. So I engage Michael's blade on the outside and I press essentially to his centre. And I think, I'm not sure if you can feel it. There we go. So I'm going very, very closely to the to the outside of his centre, and Michael is doing a guardant. He feels like he's safe. So again, this is a good one for him to think that he's very safe with. But actually, from his point of view, my sword is actually still very close to him. It's still very much on line of him, which means I can very easily change my angle and defeat him. Whereas, and I'm going to do the same one for you, and I won't make it obvious, but I'm going to let you know that I'm doing the other way. So if I do the same thing, I'm still just going towards his centre, but now when he's done the correct action, he feels much safer. My blade is away from him and he's in no danger anymore. So as you're training these, make it very obvious, make those lines right to the shoulder, right to the shoulder. And then as you start getting a little bit better at them, you bring that in. So maybe make it to the nipple line, halfway between the shoulder and the centre line. Here. And you see here already, Michael sees he's made the mistake. And there is his mistake here, or here, or here. But he can now immediately see that he's made the mistake incorrectly. All this means at this point is that Michael has not trained that pressure sensitivity very far, and that's fine. We haven't trained it much in class. But that is what you are aiming to achieve, is every action on your blade, you will make the safest reaction. And then once you have those, you can then learn how to make appropriate counterattacks from there. So hopefully that's been very useful for you. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in class.